Hello and welcome to this quick guide to how to be successful in the BTEC Level 2 Media. We're going to look briefly at Component 2, which is the coursework module that the students are currently working on. And then we're going to talk a bit about Component 3, which is the final exam, and how students can prepare for that. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll understand how that final assessment works and how the students should be preparing for it. So the Year 11 students began their Component 2 assessment at the start of October, and that was split into two tasks, which they needed to manage in their own time to ensure it was completed and polished by the end of this term. It contributes to 30% of the final mark, which is then added to Component 1 from last year in Year 10 to make up 60% of the final grade. It's important to note that all the skills that they've used in this unit will be tested again in the final assessment. So that will include researching, planning, producing and polishing a finished media product to a specific brief provided by the exam board. So what they should be doing now is reflecting on how they can improve next time. What evidence for pre-production could they have made? How could they have better refined their ideas to meet the brief? How could they have managed their time better? And what key skills do they need to develop, like Photoshop, before they move on to that final production piece? It is vitally important that students use their revision time at home. Unlike with traditional subjects where you're memorizing facts and figures, they should actually be practicing their research and planning documents, drawing out sketches, annotating them, and looking at how they can improve them so that in the 9 hours of assessment time, they will simply be reproducing those pre-production and production documents that they have planned in advance. The experience they've had on Component 2, where they've created their own media products using original photography, copywriting, and design layout skills, will be what they're developing on. So they need to look back critically at how their visual and written elements have improved, but also how they can take that next step further. They are encouraged to come to media at lunchtimes to practice their Photoshop skills or to install the software at home using their Creative Cloud login. They can either ask me to show them or they can use YouTube tutorials for those specific skills where they see a gap. So at home, students should have a quiet and comfortable studying environment. They should set a schedule with achievable goals so that they can come to each of the exam sessions fully prepared, knowing exactly what they're going to produce, that they've practiced and perfected before they even start. So on the screen, you can see some of the questions that I got students to encourage people to ask them. And these are great for Component 3 as well. Quizzing them on how their idea meets the theme of the brief, or reviewing their photos and articles with them in order to give your own opinions will really help them to get that final polish on their media product. They aren't able to bring those notes into the exam sessions, but having that feedback is really going to help them perfect, polish, and produce an amazing piece of work. I can't stress enough the importance of planning and time management to the students in this final assessment. They are given the exam paper well in advance, so they're given a lot of opportunities to research and plan, and those are crucial marked skills that gets them a success in BTEC Media. By staying organised and managing their time effectively, they are ensuring that they've met all of those assessment requirements, and it helps to avoid all of that last minute stress on the 12th of March, the day before our first assessment session. So after the Christmas break, we will focus on the final assessment. This is Component 3, where students will be issued a final brief from the exam board. Usually this comes in late January. And they respond to that brief by independently planning, designing, and creating a print media product through 3 activities that are done under exam conditions. In total, it's a 9-hour assessment, and it makes up the final 40% of their BTEC. And it must be submitted for students to be awarded a grade for that qualification. As we're not allowed to give specific advice and guidance once that assessment period starts, it's really important that students prepare in full beforehand. So asking questions when the brief is first issued, make sure they know what they need to do and what they need to produce. They need to go away and research existing products for the conventions that they want to include and how that appeals to audiences. And they're also going to need to make sure that they revise all of their key terms so they can use those fluently in their assessment. I will provide them with a revision guide to help them structure their responses, but as they can choose any format and any approach, it's only for the structure and it won't teach them any new content or techniques. The first activity they'll do is their ideas log. They have up to 3 hours to do this, and they'll show their interpretation of the brief, discuss the research that they've done, the ideas that they've come up with, and the processes they went through, who their target is, and how they've selected their final idea to appeal to that target audience. It's really important here to know that they can't access the internet or to take notes into the exam with them. So it's kind of upping the ante from component 2, where they were able to use internet resources and bring their class notes. Now they have to remember the research they've done and be able to articulate their findings. The second activity is to produce their planning material. That usually takes about 2 hours, but activity 1 and activity 2 are done on the same day, on the 13th of March, so they can spend that time in those 5 hours however they see fit, going backwards and forwards between the two activities if they want to make improvements and refinements as they go along. The planning material that they produce needs to be detailed, it needs to be annotated, and it needs to be clear. And again, it all needs to be memorized because no notes are allowed into the session. To give you a bit of an idea, the exam board says that the planning material should be detailed enough to be given to somebody else who could then make the product. And that's if they want to meet those merit or distinction mark bands. So it's really highly recommended that they practice multiple times drawing this out at home so that they're comfortable, that they've got enough detail, but they can also achieve it in the time they're setting for themselves. So as I've mentioned before, the inset day on the 13th of March will be the first 5 hours of that 9-hour assessment. Once they've completed those first 5 hours for activity 1 and 2, they won't be able to go back and make any changes to those documents for activity 1 or 2, but they will have access to them as reference when they move on to actually create their product. From the 14th of March onwards, students are going to be using lessons and homework time to begin creating the assets they need to make their final product. That means taking original photos, writing copy, designing logos, anything that they need to produce, they can start making that in advance. It's really important that they include original images in their final product if they want to achieve a level 2 pass or higher, which is the equivalent of a grade 4 for GCSE. They will then produce 3 separate pages, whether that's a front cover of a magazine and a double page spread article, or 3 individual posters, or whichever products they've chosen must be 3 pages long and demonstrate as many of the skills they've learned over the 2 years as possible, including use of color, typography, layout, and all of those design principles. The final assessment sessions will happen after the art and photography exams in April, and they will take place during timetabled media lessons to minimise the interruption with any other subjects. But we need to make sure we meet the final exam deadline, so all of those products will be completed by the 10th of May. And that's a fixed deadline so that entries can be collated and sent to the exam board so that they can be put in for this exam series. So those dates to remember are our coursework pieces in on the 23rd of November. Any resubmissions need to be done by the 8th of December for that coursework. And then in January 2024, we move on to that final exam brief. Activities 1 and 2 total 5 hours, which are done on the inset day of the 13th of March. And that will include all of their research and planning for their media products. Activity 3 will then have a small gap where they can pull together the assets and create their logos, slogans, write articles, and take photographs. And then we'll move into the final production in controlled conditions within the media lessons so that they can create that by the final deadline of the 10th of May. This does mean that all media students will be finished with their course by the 10th of May. And that will give them ample opportunity then to refocus on their other subjects and the exams throughout May and June. So all students will be given their revision guide in January, and you're encouraged to go through this with them, get them to explain the brief to you, who their target audience is, and then how they're going to create a media product that meets the needs of the audience and the needs of the brief. Ask them to show you their ideas for photographs. Look at the photographs they've taken. Read through any articles that they've written, and make sure that students are aware of when their deadlines are. The good news is that after completing Component 2, all of the students now have the necessary skills to independently access Component 3, the final assessment. Any students that want a bit more guidance and a bit more help will be able to come to the Media Suite at lunchtimes to use the facilities, to ask questions, and to work together to build their skills in Photoshop. They're also encouraged to use the camera equipment and lighting to practice different poses and lighting techniques. And all students are encouraged to be as creative as possible with their final production piece so they can show off all of those amazing skills that they've learned over the last 2 years.